All right, everyone, welcome into Anatomy and Physiology 2. I hope you are all as excited as I am to get into the material in this class and finish up learning the systems of the human body that we did not quite get to in Anatomy and Physiology 1. So our first topic in Anatomy and Physiology 2 is going to be the endocrine system. Now, if you made it through Anatomy and Physiology 1, you should have at least by now heard of the endocrine system, and you should have about scratched the surface on what the endocrine system is. I definitely won't expect you all to be experts on the endocrine system until we've finished this lecture presentation. However, I want you all to think back to when you covered the 11 body systems in Anatomy and Physiology 1. Some of the things that you might have heard of the endocrine system is that there are many different organs and glands that contribute to the endocrine system, and that its main purpose is to release hormones that will regulate different body activities. You may have discussed the components of the endocrine system, such as the specific organs that are involved, but beyond that, I don't expect you to have much knowledge on the endocrine system. Now, if you do have knowledge on the endocrine system beyond that, wonderful. You're already one step ahead of the game. However, I'm going to assume that you have not heard much about the endocrine system, so for students that have not heard much about the endocrine system, this is going to be especially geared towards you. So in this lecture presentation, we're going to cover some of the physiology of the endocrine system, and we're especially going to go into the specific endocrine organs and their particular hormonal secretions. We're going to take this quite a bit further than we did in A&P1, and we're going to discuss the specific hormones that come from each individual endocrine organ. We're going to discuss that hormone's action, and some pathological conditions that are related to the endocrine system as a whole. So the final topic that you would have discussed in Anatomy and Physiology 1 is the nervous system. And what we can hopefully remember about the nervous system is that it's our body's major communicative system. The nervous system is responsible for sending signals throughout the body. However, the nervous system is not the only communicative system that our body has. The endocrine system is an extremely important communicative system, but it's going to work a little differently than the nervous system does. Again, what we need to keep in mind about the endocrine system is that when we think endocrine, we automatically want to think hormone. When you hear the nervous system, you want to start thinking about neurotransmitters, but the endocrine system is responsible for releasing hormones. So what we find about these two systems is that they are synergistic and that they work together to regulate our body's activities. Now, I'll just say once more that these two systems work very, very differently. With the nervous system, we saw the action of neurotransmitters at the synapse, and that's how we transmitted information from one cell to another. But we're specifically going to break down the physiology of the endocrine system and how it works in this lecture presentation. So instead of using synapses to transfer information from one cell to another, the endocrine system is actually going to use the bloodstream to transport hormones throughout the body. The cardiovascular system is the next system that we're going to be covering right after the endocrine system. But what we need to know about the cardiovascular system is that it's composed of the heart, which is functioning to pump blood through the vessels, and the vasculature of the body, such as the arteries and the veins, travel all throughout the body. Because the blood vessels of the cardiovascular system are so diffuse, using the bloodstream to transport hormones is very effective for reaching all parts of the body. So when an endocrine organ releases hormones, it's going to be released directly to the interstitial fluid around the cell that released it, and then it will diffuse into the bloodstream and be transported throughout the body in the blood. So when we hear the word endocrine, we not only want to think of hormones, but we also want to think of blood. And this is because the endocrine system uses the bloodstream to transport hormones throughout the body to reach what are known as target cells. The phrase target cells just refers to a general understanding of the specific cell that a hormone will act on. We're going to see that there are different target cells for all different endocrine organs, but what all target cells are going to have are some type of receptor. By now, we should be very familiar with receptors. Those often will sit on the outside of the cell membrane, and they will cause some type of intracellular change when the ligand binds to the receptor. Just one example of somewhere that we saw receptors was with neurotransmitters in the nervous system. Now, one thing that confused me when I started learning about these two systems was the difference between hormones and neurotransmitters. Now, neurotransmitters and hormones are just chemicals. They have a very unique structure, and that's what makes them special and different from other neurotransmitters and other hormones. In theory, neurotransmitters and hormones are actually very similar because they just both refer to chemicals. However, their method of delivery to their target cells is what makes them different. We will often see neurotransmitters acting within the nervous system, and they act more locally. In so many words, neurotransmitters can be found specifically at a synapse. However, hormones will act a little differently, as I just mentioned. The major way of transportation of hormones is through the bloodstream. So hormones tend to have more of a far-reaching effect because hormones enter the bloodstream and get transported all the way throughout the body. Now, hormones are only going to actually affect their own target cells. However, if large concentrations of hormones are released by the endocrine system, we'll see that those hormones can be found all throughout the bloodstream. One of the other major differences we see between these two communicative systems is that the nervous system typically tends to act faster, while the endocrine system tends to work slower. However, the effects of the endocrine system generally last longer, and the effects of the nervous system are much more short-lived. Now, in order for us to start understanding endocrine glands, we also must understand exocrine glands. These are some examples of exocrine glands that we discussed in A&P 1, the sudoriferous or the sweat glands, the sebaceous glands, the oil glands, and a few others are all examples of exocrine glands. So as we're now aware, the endocrine system releases hormones into the bloodstream. However, exocrine glands will always release some type of secretory product into a duct that will flow out onto a surface. So sweat glands, for example, will release sweat that's going to flow into a duct and be released out onto the surface of the skin. This is in turn going to help us to thermoregulate our bodies. The secretion itself with exocrine glands never goes into the bloodstream. Again, as we did more about these in A&P 1, we're mostly focusing on endocrine glands in this presentation. So the key with endocrine glands is that the cells that are releasing the hormones are directly going to have their secretions filling the interstitial fluid around the cells. And once those secretory hormones are in the interstitial fluid, they will then be allowed to diffuse into the bloodstream and get transported throughout the body through the different blood vessels. It is then the bloodstream that is responsible for taking those hormones to their destination, which are the target cells. Again, target cells is a very generalized word. There are lots of target cells for different endocrine organs. But what's nice about the endocrine system is that all of the endocrine glands work the same way. So now that we have some understanding of how the endocrine system works, it's important that we start to get a grasp on what actual endocrine organs we have in our bodies. You'll see that listed down here and on the next slide are some of the endocrine organs that we're going to be discussing. So the hypothalamus found within the brain is actually going to be the major part of our brain that controls the endocrine system. And we'll talk a little bit more about how this works in a little while. We'll find the thymus, the kidneys, the gonads, such as the ovaries and testes, the stomach, the skin. All of these structures are responsible in some way for releasing hormones. However, not all of the endocrine organs are listed here. We're going to come greatly to talk about the pituitary gland and the pineal gland, the thyroid gland, the adrenal glands and the pancreas, as well as the parathyroid glands. So this slide is more accurately going to show you the major endocrine organs that we're going to be discussing in this presentation. I like to start from the top down, so we'll see that the hypothalamus is found here. The pituitary gland hangs from the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland can be found behind the hypothalamus. The pineal gland is part of something known as the epithalamus. We'll find the thyroid gland that can be found here in the base of the neck, the thymus, which can be found between both of the lungs and just above the heart. This little area is known as the mediastinum, so we'll find the thymus inside of this mediastinum. We'll see the adrenal glands attached to the top of the kidneys, and the pancreas that can be found behind the stomach. The pancreas is in fact my favorite endocrine organ. We'll see the gonads, the testes in males, and the ovaries in females, and the parathyroid glands that can be found on the back of the thyroid gland. So a very high yield exam question that I suggest that you all study for are where each of these endocrine organs can be found. The location of these endocrine glands is very, very important. So the key to hormonal action are the receptors that are possessed by the target cells. This is how certain hormones only affect certain target cells. If a cell does not have receptors for a particular hormone, that hormone will leave that cell unaffected. So the amount of receptors contained by a particular target cell is always changing. In general, target cells contain between 2,000 and 100,000 receptors for any specific hormone. But as I just mentioned, this number is always changing, which brings us into the concepts of downregulation and upregulation. Downregulation is when a particular target cell decreases the amount of available receptors that it has. This often occurs when there's a very high concentration of hormones present, and our body is trying to desensitize that particular hormonal response. However, the opposite can happen when there are low concentrations of hormones. If there aren't enough hormones being released, our target cells perhaps might upregulate the amount of receptors they have, and therefore make more receptors. And in turn, the increase in hormonal receptors will increase the interactions that hormones can have with those receptors, and that will in turn sensitize our cell and increase a response. One of the many uses for understanding the importance of receptors to the endocrine systems are drugs. What we should know about receptors by now is that it is possible for us to synthesize some type of chemical that will bind to the receptor, however, not activate it. That type of chemical is often referred to as an antagonist. So specifically with endocrine disorders and hormonal imbalances, it's very possible that we can synthesize certain drugs that will bind to those receptors to produce a more desired effect with a particular endocrine organ. So just by knowing a little bit of the physiology of how the endocrine system works, we can use that knowledge to manipulate the endocrine system to treat different conditions. Now, one thing that we're going to see is that there are two functional classifications for hormones. The first, which are shown on this slide, are circulating hormones, and the next, shown on this slide, are the local hormones. I'll discuss the local hormones in just a second, but I'm going to get through these circulating hormones first. Now, circulating hormones are hormones that are released into the bloodstream. These are the types of hormones that I've been talking about this entire lecture presentation. The endocrine cell itself is going to have some type of secretory product that will be released into the interstitial fluid. Those particular hormones are going to diffuse into the bloodstream from the interstitial fluid and then be transported throughout the body through the blood vessels. Once these hormones reach their particular target cells, you'll see that they will come and interact with their particular receptors and produce some effect in these target cells. Now, we haven't quite gotten to all of the different effects that can occur from hormones binding to their receptors. But again, we want to make sure we're focusing on how this system works so that we can then understand the specific effects of these hormones and how they are propagated. So most of our endocrine organs are in fact considered circulating hormones. However, we also have another class known as the local hormones. Now, again, described over here, local hormones are hormones that do not enter into the bloodstream. There are two major types of local hormones, paracrine hormones and autocrine hormones. And we can also refer to these as paracrines and autocrines. Truly, the only difference between an autocrine and a paracrine is which cell they're going to act on. Autocrine means particular hormones that are going to affect the exact same cell that released them. Autocrine means self, so when a cell releases hormones, and those hormones come over here and act on these receptors on the same cell membrane of the cell that released them, that is known as an autocrine. Autocrines are one way that particular cells can amplify their own response. When we use the phrase paracrine, on the other hand, this refers to a particular cell that's going to release its hormones, and those hormones are going to go and act on a neighboring cell. And that's why we refer to these as local hormones, because these hormones stay within the same place in the body. They do not enter the bloodstream and transport systemically throughout the systems. So autocrine means self. This is when a cell releases hormones, and those hormones go and affect receptors on that very same cell's surface. Para means beside, so the paracrines are going to be hormones that are released to neighboring cells that are right next door, or perhaps a few cells away. And endocrine hormones are going to be specific hormones that are released by particular cells that will eventually enter the bloodstream and be transported systemically throughout the body. Now we can say that the words endocrine, paracrine, and autocrine are words that more describe a functional classification of particular hormones. However, there's also going to be more of a structural classification of hormones, and that would be referring to a particular chemical structure that a hormone has. There are two major chemical classes of hormones, and those are lipid-soluble hormones and water-soluble hormones. The lipid-soluble hormones are going to be lipophilic and therefore hydrophobic, which means that these ones are not going to mix well in water. And then the water-soluble hormones are going to be hydrophilic and therefore lipophobic, which means that these will dissolve nicely in water. Steroid hormones, thyroid hormones, and nitric oxide are all examples of lipid-soluble hormones, while amine hormones, peptide and protein hormones, and icosanoid hormones are all examples of water-soluble hormones. So what we're going to see about the two different chemical classes of hormones is that both of these will circulate differently because the blood plasma is a water-soluble environment. These water-soluble hormones are able to get dissolved into the blood plasma, while the lipid-soluble hormones have to have transport proteins that will allow them to freely circulate in the bloodstream. This is because lipid-soluble hormones do not mesh well with the watery characteristics of blood plasma. Just to give you all a little introduction about each of these types of hormones, I'll start by briefly explaining steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are always going to be derived from the molecule cholesterol. If you go to page 627 in your textbook, you'll see an example of cholesterol shown on that page. Now there are many different types of steroid hormones, and they're all going to have a cholesterol backbone. But what's different about these, and what makes these hormones different from each other, are the different chemical groups that are branching out from the cholesterol molecule. Steroid hormones are a very diverse group of hormones because we can have so many different types of these. As for thyroid hormones, there are only two types of thyroid hormones. We'll learn their specific names, but for now I'm going to refer to them as T3 and T4. Thyroid hormones are made by connecting an iodine atom to the amino acid tyrosine. I won't make you draw out any of these, but I do want you to know the structure of each of these. Nitric oxide actually often acts as both a neurotransmitter and a hormone, and one of its major functions is to relax smooth muscles that are found in the blood vessels. All three of these molecules are lipid-soluble and therefore do not dissolve well in water, which means that they do not dissolve well in plasma because plasma is in fact mostly water. To real quickly explain the water-soluble hormones, we'll start with the amine hormones. An amino group in terms of organic chemistry refers to the group that is shown here. One nitrogen and either 2 or 3 hydrogens bound to it. Whenever you have that particular arrangement of chemicals, this is referred to as an amino group. So amine hormones just retain an amino group somewhere in them. Peptide hormones and protein hormones are actually quite similar to each other. These are hormones that are made out of polymers of amino acids. Peptide hormones are simply just a little bit smaller than protein hormones, and the specific way that we classify these is that if any particular peptide hormone has between 3 and 49 amino acids, when you get to 50, you then start referring to it as a protein hormone. So peptide hormones are just very short versions of protein hormones. But in theory, they're pretty much the same thing. They're just long chains of amino acids. Peptide hormones just tend to have fewer amino acids in their chains than protein hormones do. And lastly, the icosanoids are derived from a specific chemical known as arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid is a 20-carbon fatty acid, and there are two major types of icosanoids, the prostaglandins and the leukotrienes. There will be some more information involving icosanoids towards the end of this lecture presentation, but for now I just want you to have a little idea of what differentiates each of these different types of hormones. Now on this slide we discuss a little bit about hormonal action. There is a vast amount of different types of actions that we find hormones having in the body. Depending on the specific structure of a hormone and the receptors found on a target cell, we will see different actions taking place at different places throughout the body. Some examples of responses due to hormonal stimulation are all shown here at the base of this slide. We'll see new molecules being made very often in response to different hormonal secretions, and we'll often find the permeability of certain cell membranes changing, either becoming more or less permeable based on hormones that are present. This is something we're going to see very prevalent in the urinary system. Hormones can increase or decrease the rate of our body's metabolism, and also influence how much of a substance is moved towards the inside or the outside of our cells. Lastly, here you'll also see our two types of involuntary muscles can also be affected by hormonal stimulation. But first things first, none of these things can happen unless a hormone makes contact with the receptors on the particular target cell that's going to facilitate one of these responses. Now, we just discussed the lipid-soluble hormones with the water-soluble hormones. Now, the difference between these is not just that the lipid-soluble hormones need a transport protein in order to get around in the bloodstream. There are other implications of molecules being either water-soluble or lipid-soluble when it comes to hormones. For example, it's very easy for water-soluble molecules to be transported throughout the blood because they mix well with the blood plasma. However, if you can recall the major component of our cell's membrane, they are phospholipids. The phospholipids in the cell membrane, if you can remember, allow certain things to cross and will not allow other things to cross. So those water-soluble molecules will have a nice easy time being transported throughout the bloodstream. However, when they reach the cell membrane, they're not going to be able to cross. And this is going to influence where the receptors on the target cell can be found. We'll actually find the receptors for water-soluble hormones on the surface of the cell because those hormones aren't able to cross the membrane freely. This is the exact opposite with our lipid-soluble hormones. Those have a little bit of a harder time getting transported throughout the bloodstream, but once we have a transport protein that can take them here and there, the lipid-soluble hormones are actually able to freely cross the membrane because they can interact with the phospholipids in the cell membrane. So one thing that we're going to see with our lipid-soluble hormones is that their receptors are actually going to be found inside of the cell. So the difference in the two mechanism of actions that we see with these different two types of hormones, lipid-soluble and water-soluble, is what we're going to see on these next two slides. So on this slide, we see the mechanism of lipid-soluble hormones. Lipid-soluble hormones are able to diffuse freely through the cell membrane, and therefore they will interact with an intracellular receptor. We have to keep in mind that there will be a transport protein that will aid in the transport of the hormone to the particular target cell. But once our hormone has been transported to the target cell, we'll see that that particular lipid-soluble hormone is able to go directly through the cell membrane without any opposition from the cell. If you can remember, the nucleus has its own membrane known as the nuclear envelope. It's actually a double membrane, but it's made out of similar components of the cell membrane. So in fact, this lipid-soluble hormone will also cross through the nucleus, and that's where we'll find our intracellular receptor. You can see this receptor is shown here, and it's depicted as incomplete. But once this hormone fits in to the receptor, that changes the composition of the receptor. The change makes the receptor what we would call active. Now, the key with lipid-soluble hormones is that we'll have what's known as the receptor hormone complex, which is where we want to put our interest. We call it the receptor hormone complex because it is the hormone attached to the receptor together, and this complex is what's going to go and affect the DNA. This receptor hormone complex will have a particular spot on the DNA strand that we'll find in the nucleus. It will bind to that DNA, and this will then in turn alter gene expression, either turning on a particular gene or turning it off. You can see in this example, this particular receptor hormone complex is going to bind to the DNA and turn on gene transcription of mRNA inside of the nucleus. So we're going to get an additional strand of mRNA that we didn't have before because the receptor hormone complex bound to the DNA and turned on the gene to transcribe this mRNA strand. mRNA, as it does, is going to leave the nucleus and go to a ribosome where we will then synthesize new proteins through the process of translation. And now this new protein is going to have some effect on our cell. The response of this new protein is what's sort of looked at as the action of the initial hormone that came in. When this hormone is released, we get a particular effect that is caused by this protein. So we associate the effect of this protein with the hormone that came in to cause this change in cellular activity, and therefore we would say that this hormone has the particular action that was facilitated by this new protein that was made. So this slide depicts how lipid-soluble hormones will act. Now this slide is going to tell us the mechanism of action of our water-soluble hormones. And water-soluble hormones use what is known as a second messenger system and something referred to as a G protein. Since our water-soluble hormones are unable to cross the cell membrane on their own, they have to bind to some receptor that can be found on the outside of our cell. Once the hormone is bound to the receptor, we're going to see that there's a cascade of events that occurs inside of the cell to produce the desired effect of that hormone. So let's break this slide down. So water-soluble hormones are going to be freely transported throughout the plasma. These water-soluble hormones are going to eventually diffuse out of the bloodstream into the interstitial fluid and then come and bind to the receptors that are found on the outside of the target cells. Now the receptors on the target cells are coupled with what is known as a G protein. We're going to see that this G protein is going to be vital for the activation of what's known as the second messenger system. Once activated, this G protein is going to make its way over to this enzyme known as adenylyl cyclase. Remember, ASE indicates that we're talking about an enzyme, so adenylyl cyclase refers to an enzyme that can be found in the membrane of these target cells. Once activated, the adenylyl cyclase is going to take a molecule of ATP and convert it into another molecule known as cyclic AMP. This stands for cyclic adenosine monophosphate. Cyclic AMP, shown here, is our second messenger. So let's take a step back and go through some of these events one more time. So the hormone is what's referred to as the first messenger. Essentially, we have one messenger taking the signal over here, but since there's a blockage here, this hormone can't enter the cell. So that's the first messenger, and we have to get the message to what's known as a second messenger. The second messenger is going to indicate to this cell that a hormone has bound to the receptor, and that will then allow us to facilitate the action of that hormone. So we have the hormone binding to the receptor activates the G protein, which in turn activates adenylyl cyclase, and adenylyl cyclase will take ATP and convert that to cyclic AMP. So that's why we refer to this mechanism of action as including a second messenger system. Now once cyclic AMP is activated, it will then in turn activate another enzyme. It's going to take what are known as protein kinases and activate them. So you might be wondering what a protein kinase is. Any type of enzyme that's referred to as a kinase is an enzyme that phosphorylates another molecule. And that just means that we're adding a phosphate group to a molecule. So cyclic AMP will activate these protein kinases, and then these protein kinases will use the additional phosphate group on ATP to phosphorylate different proteins inside of the cell. And you can see we've taken a protein now, and with ATP, we move the phosphate group from ATP to the protein, and that's what we're showing you here. Some type of protein has now just been phosphorylated, and we're left with ADP on the other end. Depending upon the hormone that binds to the specific receptor, the phosphorylated protein that has now been synthesized may either activate or inactivate other things within the cell. On page 629 in your book, you'll see an example of the different types of effects these phosphorylated proteins can have. Is one particular phosphorylated protein might break down triglycerides, while another may promote protein synthesis. It just depends on the particular hormone that has bound to our cell surface. So it is the phosphorylated protein that causes the change in the activity of our cell. So you can look at this step 5 as the major goal of releasing the hormone. The hormone has come and bound to the receptor, and through a cascade of events, we've now phosphorylated an additional protein, and that phosphorylated protein will have some type of additional effect. And lastly, we'll want to be able to turn this process off. So phosphodiesterase is a specific enzyme that will actually inactivate cyclic AMP. Very important enzyme that I'd very much like you to know. So what you're not able to see from this slide is that when a hormone binds to its receptors, many different G proteins are going to go and activate many different molecules of adenylyl cyclase. It's not just one G protein per one receptor. We have lots of G proteins that are bound to one individual receptor, and those G proteins will then individually go and activate many other enzymes. When many molecules of adenylyl cyclase are active, we're going to be making lots and lots and lots of cyclic AMP molecules. Just so that you're aware, cyclic AMP is not the only second messenger that we have in our bodies. We also have a molecule known as cyclic GMP, we have IP3, and we have DAG. All three of those additional second messengers can be found on page 629 in your textbook. So now that we have a good understanding of how hormones travel from their endocrine organ to their target cells, we can now put a little bit more emphasis on where those target cells are and how those target cells work. So you can see on this slide that there are several factors that affect how target cells respond to various hormones. These three major factors are the concentration of the particular hormone that it can be found in the blood and that is released, the amount of receptors that can be found on the target cell. Keep in mind that this number is going to be changing constantly as we have up and down regulation. And we also have the presence of other hormones that can also affect how target cells will respond to a particular hormone that has been released. So out of the three of these factors, the most straightforward to understand would be the concentration of the particular hormone. The more hormone that is released, the greater an effect that hormone is going to have on the target cell. If we only release a little bit of a hormone from a particular endocrine organ, that's only going to incite a very, very mild response. Now that is true in most part, as the number of receptors is also very, very important. The more receptors that we have on a particular target cell for a specific hormone will also increase the activity of that target cell. If we have lots and lots and lots of receptors that are receiving hormones, we're going to have more G proteins that are active, more cyclic AMP that is produced, and therefore, in turn, we're going to be phosphorylating more proteins. But if a target cell only has a few receptors that can be found on its surface, once we've maxed out on the amount of hormones that are binding to those receptors, we're not going to be able to increase that response until we upregulate that receptor. The last factor here that's a little bit more complex than the others are the synergistic and antagonistic effects of particular hormones. When the effect of two different hormones acting together is greater than their sum of individual effects, we say that those two hormones have a synergistic effect. Conversely, if two hormones oppose the action of each other, we say that those two hormones have an antagonistic effect. So it's very important that we understand how these mechanisms of hormone action are going to work. If we have a very large concentration of hormone that has been released, and we have a very large number of hormone receptors that are present, we would be led to believe that there's going to be a very, very large response that is facilitated from these. However, if we are at the same time releasing an antagonistic hormone, that will somewhat negate the effect of the response that was facilitated by these two factors. So one other way that we can look at this is the more concentration of hormones released, the greater the effect is going to be. The more receptors that can be found on our cell, the more response we'll get from that target cell. And the more synergistic two hormones are, the greater their effects will be. So if we flip this on its head, the lower the concentration of the hormone, the weaker the response will be. The fewer number of hormone receptors, the weaker the response will be. And the more antagonistic two hormones might be, will also decrease the hormone's response in general. So what's interesting about hormones is that they are frequently released in little bursts. These bursts tend to be brief, however, they release many hormones every time we have a burst. The more hormones that need to be released from a particular endocrine cell, the more frequently these bursts will occur in reference to each other. The three signals that regulate hormone secretion are, of course, signals from the nervous system, chemical changes that occur in the blood, and of course, different hormones can affect the rate of release of the particular hormone that we're looking at. Now, to take us back to Anatomy and Physiology 1, we see that most hormonal regulatory systems work by negative feedback mechanisms. In review from Anatomy and Physiology 1, the goal of a negative feedback system is to immediately bring a controlled condition back to normal. So a real-life example of a negative feedback loop would be your thermostat. If you have your thermostat set to, let's say, 75 degrees, when the internal temperature of your home increases or decreases, the thermostat will turn on and restore the internal temperature to 75 degrees. In general, the body has more negative feedback mechanisms than we'll find positive feedback mechanisms. You'll see that this slide contains a couple examples of hormonal secretion and the different mechanisms that we use to regulate it. So the neural response would refer to signals that come from the nervous system and how that will affect the secretion of particular hormones. You'll see that the autonomic nervous system can release epinephrine or norepinephrine to the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands in return will release more epinephrine and norepinephrine into the circulation. This is just one way that the nervous system will regulate hormonal secretion. A humoral example is when blood glucose levels change. You've likely heard before of these two hormones, insulin and glucagon, as they are the two hormones that control our blood glucose levels. So when blood glucose levels decrease or increase, the pancreas is constantly going to be releasing insulin or glucagon in response. When blood glucose levels rise, we're going to release insulin, and this will cause our body cells to take up more blood glucose, in turn decreasing our level of blood glucose. The reason that our blood glucose drops is because the glucose that was in the blood is taken up by our cells. Glucagon is a hormone that has an antagonistic effect with insulin, so we get to see two concepts at play here. When blood glucose levels drop, glucagon is going to be released, and when glucagon is in high concentrations, that's going to stimulate the breakdown of glycogen in liver cells to release glucose into the bloodstream. Lastly, one of the ways that other hormones can affect hormonal secretion is based on the hypothalamus and releasing and inhibiting hormones. The hypothalamus has the role of releasing what are known as releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. Releasing hormones stimulate other endocrine organs to release specific hormones, and inhibiting hormones will tell endocrine organs to stop releasing those particular hormones. TRH stands for thyrotropin releasing hormone, which will directly affect the thyroid gland to release more thyroid hormone. So this thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus will make its way over to the anterior pituitary gland, and then the anterior pituitary gland will have the signal to release thyroid stimulating hormone. This should actually say TSH, so just make a note of that as you are watching this. But then thyroid stimulating hormone will make its way over to the thyroid gland to release T3 and T4, which are our thyroid hormones. Now, there are many other examples of these three means of hormone regulation, but this slide just contains an example of each just to give you an idea of how hormonal secretion is regulated in general.